The morning had started like any other in London, the kind of crisp, calm day where the city hums with routine and life seems predictably steady. But for Meghan Markle, the air felt heavier, charged with a tension she could not shake. The news had come in waves, subtle, insidious, creeping through the palace corridors before reaching her ears. Prince William had spoken, and the words cut deeper than any media rumor or whispered speculation. Titles, privileges, recognition, everything she and Harry had carried as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex was gone. Forever. The announcement was not just formal, it was personal. It was the kind of declaration that could unravel the carefully constructed narrative of one's life in an instant. Meghan, who had navigated a whirlwind journey from Hollywood actress to royal consort, now felt the ground give way beneath her. The foundation of her world, built on ceremonies, protocol, and public perception, was crumbling. For years, Meghan had walked a delicate tightrope. Every smile, every gesture, every word spoken in public had been scrutinized, dissected, and often weaponized against her. The press had been relentless, painting her alternately as a charming outsider, a scheming opportunist, and a threat to the monarchy's sanctity. Within the palace walls, whispers had swirled, questions had been raised, and subtle divisions had formed, often without anyone daring to voice them aloud. Yet despite this, Meghan had pressed forward, determined to prove herself. She had believed in her marriage, in her role, and in the possibility of bridging worlds, American celebrity and British royalty. She had believed in her ability to adapt, to earn her place, to protect her family. And for a while, it seemed she had succeeded. But success in the royal sphere is never absolute, never permanent, and the announcement from William was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of favor. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. William's declaration was not merely administrative, it was symbolic. In stripping Meghan and Harry of their titles, he was drawing a line in the sand, marking a boundary that could never be crossed again. It was a statement of authority, of lineage, of the unyielding power of tradition over personal desire. And yet, the human cost of such a statement was immediate and profound. Meghan had prepared for media scrutiny, for the judgment of the public, for whispered conversations at gala events or whispered in palace hallways. She had not, however, prepared for the sheer emotional weight of being told she was no longer recognized by the very institution she had worked tirelessly to honor. In that moment, every achievement, every carefully crafted public appearance, every effort to integrate into a centuries-old system felt null and void. The titles had represented status, security, and legitimacy. Without them, Meghan felt exposed, vulnerable, and painfully aware of the world's gaze. As the words settled in, Meghan's mind raced through a lifetime of memories, some triumphant, some humiliating, some painfully ordinary. She remembered her first steps into the palace, her nervous laughter at state dinners, her attempts to navigate intricate social hierarchies and unspoken expectations. She thought of Harry, steadfast by her side, whose own struggles had mirrored hers in ways the public could never understand. They had faced criticism together, defended each other against rumor and innuendo, and presented a united front to a world that often seemed determined to pull them apart. But now, William's pronouncement had introduced a new fracture, one that cut deeper than any external attack. It was familial, it was intimate, it was irrevocable. Meghan could feel the chill of that reality settle into her chest, a physical weight that seemed to press down with every heartbeat. There was also the broader context, the public ramifications that would follow almost instantly. Media outlets would descend on the story like vultures circling prey, dissecting every angle, amplifying every perceived slight. Headlines would scream betrayal, scandal, and drama. Social media would erupt with opinions ranging from sympathetic to vicious, and every minor detail of Meghan's life would be scrutinized for evidence of her guilt or innocence. She had lived much of her adult life in the public eye, yet nothing could have prepared her for this magnitude of exposure. This was not just a story about a title being revoked. It was a story about identity, legitimacy, and the boundaries of familial loyalty. It was the kind of event that would ripple outward, touching public perception, personal relationships, and even international diplomacy. The weight of history pressed down on her as she realized that this announcement would not merely define her present, it would reshape the narrative of her entire life. Amid the emotional turmoil, Meghan also grappled with the practical implications. Titles had not only carried ceremonial significance, they were linked to security, financial support, and access to resources that could not be easily replaced. Without them, Meghan and Harry would be stripped of certain protections, leaving them vulnerable to both real and perceived threats. They would become, in the eyes of the monarchy, private citizens, subject to the same societal pressures and dangers that ordinary people faced, without the buffer of privilege or institutional support. The realization that her world was shifting from a protected sphere into one of exposure and risk only intensified the shock. The palace had always seemed like a fortress, impenetrable in its walls of tradition and power. Now, those walls seemed to have shifted, leaving Meghan to navigate a landscape that was at once familiar and alien, comforting and treacherous. Yet even in the midst of this turmoil, Meghan's resilience surfaced. Years of public scrutiny had taught her the necessity of composure, the importance of strategic response, and the value of projecting strength even when internally unsteady. There was a clarity that came with such crises, a stark recognition that life was no longer a series of rehearsed appearances and controlled narratives, but a complex, unpredictable drama in which survival required both adaptability and courage. Meghan could not undo William's announcement. She could not appeal to the past or retreat into denial. She could, however, chart a path forward, one that would define her not by titles lost, but by the actions she would take in response to adversity. It was a moment that demanded both reflection and resolve, grief and strategy, despair and determination. As the hours passed, Meghan felt the dual pull of isolation and visibility. The palace, with its stately architecture and centuries of history, became simultaneously a cage and a stage. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every movement was imbued with significance. There was no private space, no sanctuary where she could process the enormity of the moment without fear of intrusion. And yet, in this vulnerability, there was also a profound clarity. The stripping of her title was a catalyst, a moment that forced the confrontation of both external pressures and internal truths. It demanded reckoning, not only with the monarchy and the family, but with herself. Meghan had built her identity around her roles, her relationships, and her visibility. The sudden removal of one critical layer of that identity prompted an unflinching examination of who she was, what she had achieved, and what she was willing to risk to maintain agency over her life. The tension, of course, was not solely internal. Across the palace, reactions varied. Allies within the institution grappled with loyalty, protocol, and precedent. Advisors debated the optics of William's declaration, the potential backlash, and the legal implications of removing royal titles from active family members. The corridors of power, always alive with subtle negotiation and quiet maneuvering, now buzzed with an intensity that threatened to spill into public awareness at any moment. And beyond the walls of Buckingham and Kensington, the world waited. News outlets prepared their coverage, social media analysts predicted trends, and millions of eyes were poised to witness history in the making. Meghan's personal crisis was immediately transformed into a public spectacle, a drama that blurred the lines between private pain and global intrigue. The gravity of William's announcement did not diminish as the hours stretched into the afternoon. If anything, it became heavier, more palpable, as Meghan began to feel the long shadow of consequence stretching over every aspect of her life. She paced the room, thoughts racing, recalling the early days of her and Harry's marriage. There had been hope, ambition, and a belief that love alone could navigate even the most labyrinthine of royal expectations. They had married under a global spotlight, promising unity, compassion, and modernity within a centuries-old institution. And yet, the reality of tradition, precedent, and rigid hierarchy had asserted itself in the most unforgiving of ways. William's declaration had crystallized the tension that had always existed between public expectation and private desire, between duty and self-preservation. Meghan felt as if she were being peeled back, layer by layer, until only raw, unguarded humanity remained. Her thoughts wandered to Harry. He had always been protective, often fiercely so, and the anguish in his eyes mirrored her own. Their partnership had weathered relentless media storms, public scrutiny, and even internal palace friction, but this moment was different. It was an irrevocable line drawn not by an external adversary, but by a family member, someone whose judgment carried historical and institutional weight. Meghan realized that the emotional impact was as severe as the practical implications. Titles and privileges were not merely symbols. They were markers of belonging, affirmation, and acceptance within a system she had worked tirelessly to integrate into. Their removal was an unmistakable signal. Despite everything, despite love, effort, and perseverance, she and Harry were outsiders, permanently relegated to the margins of the institution. The permanence of this judgment created an emotional whirlpool, pulling Meghan into a space where past victories felt hollow, and the path forward seemed uncertain and fraught with peril. In the quiet of her private chambers, Meghan reflected on the broader significance of this moment. This was not simply a family dispute. It was a historical turning point, one that would be scrutinized for generations. The monarchy had always been a symbol of continuity, resilience, and tradition, and decisions about titles were rarely taken lightly. William's action, though legally and institutionally justified, carried profound human consequences. It underscored the tension between individual agency and institutional authority, highlighting the delicate balance between personal desires and collective responsibilities. Meghan understood that her story would become a case study in media, law, and public perception, a cautionary tale about the consequences of navigating love, ambition, and identity within the rigid frameworks of royalty. The ripple effects of this announcement would not be confined to palace walls. They would extend into public consciousness, sparking debates, commentary, and analysis that would endure long after the initial shock had faded. The media response was immediate, explosive, and unforgiving. Headlines screamed of scandal, betrayal, and drama. Social media platforms erupted with opinion, speculation, and judgment. Meghan's every past action was reframed through the lens of this announcement, and the narrative was no longer about her personal journey, but about the seismic rupture in the monarchy itself. Analysts dissected every detail, offering legal perspectives, psychological interpretations, and historical comparisons. Pundits debated the implications for royal protocol, the potential for reconciliation, and the public relations strategies that could salvage reputation. Every tweet, every article, every broadcast added layers of pressure and scrutiny, amplifying Meghan's emotional state. She had faced media storms before, but the combination of personal betrayal, public exposure, and historical significance created a perfect storm of intensity, one that tested her resilience to its limits. Even as the media frenzy intensified, Meghan grappled with the personal dimensions of her experience. She considered the relationships she had nurtured within the royal family, friendships that had been forged in shared duty and mutual understanding. Some of those bonds now felt tenuous, strained under the weight of protocol and public expectation. Trust, she realized, was a fragile commodity in this environment, and even the strongest connections could be severed by a single authoritative declaration. Meghan thought about the future, how to maintain dignity, how to protect Harry, how to navigate the precarious intersection of public image and private reality. These questions demanded answers not just for survival, but for the preservation of identity and the ability to chart a meaningful path forward in a world that now seemed unrecognizable. In the midst of this emotional turbulence, Meghan found herself reflecting on her own resilience and the lessons learned over years of scrutiny and adaptation. She had always approached life with a strategic mindset, balancing empathy with pragmatism, hope with realism. This moment, as devastating as it felt, was also a crucible, a test of character, resolve, and ingenuity. It demanded that she confront fear, uncertainty, and loss head-on, while simultaneously crafting a narrative that would protect her legacy and that of her family. The challenge was immense, but Meghan understood that survival in the public eye had never been about avoidance. It had always been about confrontation, reinvention, and the courage to act decisively even in the face of overwhelming odds. As evening fell over London, Meghan's thoughts turned outward. She considered the global audience that watched the monarchy with fascination, expectation, and often judgment. She thought about the thousands of letters, messages, and social media posts that expressed both support and condemnation. She pondered the diverse perspectives of people who saw her as an emblem of modernity, a challenge to tradition, a figure of inspiration, or a target for criticism. The intersection of personal crisis and public spectacle created a unique pressure, one that demanded not only emotional fortitude, but also strategic acumen. Meghan understood that her response in the coming hours, days, and weeks would shape the narrative, influence public opinion, and perhaps redefine the relationship between herself and the institution she had once sought to serve. Even as she grappled with the weight of these considerations, a profound sense of loss permeated her consciousness. Titles had represented more than status. They had symbolized recognition, acceptance, and the culmination of years of effort to bridge worlds and reconcile identities. Their revocation was a stark reminder of the limits of influence, the impermanence of favor, and the unforgiving nature of hierarchical institutions. Yet within this loss, Meghan found the stirrings of determination, a recognition that while titles could be stripped, agency, voice, and resilience were not so easily taken. As the night deepened, Meghan sat in silence, the reality of the day pressing down on her like an unyielding weight. The palace, normally a place of order and routine, felt alien, cold, and unwelcoming. Every corridor, every room, seemed to echo with the unspoken judgment of centuries, a silent reminder that the monarchy's authority was absolute, and that personal feelings, no matter how profound, could be overridden by tradition and hierarchy. She traced the contours of her memories, moments of joy and challenge intertwined. Her first royal engagement, the public appearances with Harry, the carefully choreographed gestures meant to convey grace and dignity. Each memory now seemed tinged with irony, as if the very institution she had sought to honor had used her dedication as a measure against her own permanence. Her mind returned to William's words, deliberate and unwavering. The phrasing, the finality, had been carefully chosen, not cruel, perhaps, but precise and inexorable. Meghan understood the significance. This was a line drawn not in haste, but with consideration, history, and the unyielding weight of precedent. Titles, privileges, and recognition within the monarchy were not mere formalities. They were lifelines, symbols of acceptance and legitimacy. Their revocation was both a professional and personal severance, a declaration that she and Harry would no longer occupy positions of authority, influence, or representation within the institution. The permanence of this act was almost suffocating, for it carried implications far beyond the immediate circle of the family. It would influence public perception, media narratives, and even international diplomacy, subtly shifting the balance of power, allegiance, and attention within the royal sphere. Harry, though a source of strength, was himself in turmoil. Meghan thought about their conversations leading up to this point, the late-night discussions, the strategic planning, the moments of shared vulnerability. Harry had always been fiercely protective of her, often channeling anger into action, but even he seemed momentarily unmoored, caught between familial loyalty and the pain of watching the institution he loved deliver a public censure against the person he cherished most. Together, they had faced relentless scrutiny and criticism, yet this was different. This was a sanctioned, undeniable judgment, one that carried historical weight and left no room for negotiation. Meghan recognized that their partnership, while a source of resilience, could not fully shield them from the systemic and public forces now aligned against them. The broader implications began to crystallize. Meghan reflected on the global audience that had followed their journey, from the fairy tale wedding to the carefully curated public appearances, from the charitable engagements to the social initiatives they had championed. Millions had celebrated, criticized, and speculated on every move, every expression, every statement. The revocation of titles was more than a personal setback. It was a public spectacle, a cultural event that would dominate media cycles and conversation for weeks, if not months. The narrative would no longer focus on their accomplishments or philanthropic endeavors. It would pivot sharply to scandal, loss, and the drama of familial rupture. Meghan knew that the challenge now was not just personal recovery, but narrative control, the ability to navigate an intense, global media ecosystem while processing profound emotional upheaval. The press coverage was relentless. Journalists, commentators, and analysts dissected the announcement with surgical precision, drawing comparisons to historical precedents, evaluating the potential long-term ramifications, and speculating on the future of Harry and Meghan's public roles. Headlines oscillated between outrage, sympathy, and schadenfreude, reflecting the polarized nature of public opinion. Social media amplified every sentiment, every interpretation, creating a feedback loop of speculation, commentary, and emotional resonance. Meghan felt the intensity of this scrutiny, the feeling of being simultaneously invisible and hypervisible, a paradox familiar to anyone who had lived under the gaze of global attention. The pressure was immense, and the challenge of maintaining composure while navigating the intricate web of public perception was almost overwhelming. Amid this external tumult, Meghan confronted the internal landscape of her emotions. The loss of titles was symbolic of something deeper, the erosion of acceptance, the fracture of belonging, and the confrontation with institutional rigidity. She thought about the sacrifices made to integrate into the monarchy, the compromises, the careful management of behavior and image, and the constant awareness of protocol. Every decision, every word, every gesture had been weighed against centuries of expectation, yet all that effort seemed suddenly fragile and transient. This moment forced her to grapple with vulnerability in a way that was raw and unfiltered, a confrontation with the stark reality that personal effort and intention could be rendered irrelevant by the authority of a single declaration. Even in the midst of despair, Meghan found the stirrings of reflection and resolve. She considered the nature of power, privilege, and agency, recognizing that while titles could be stripped, they could not erase intellect, character, or determination. She began to frame the moment not only as a personal loss, but as an inflection point, a chance to redefine identity, agency, and purpose outside the confines of formal recognition. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenge, and likely to provoke criticism and resistance, but it also offered the possibility of reinvention, strategic action, and the cultivation of influence on terms she could define. In that quiet, intense introspection, Meghan began to conceptualize a path forward, one informed by the gravity of the present but not limited by it. As dawn approached, the weight of the announcement remained, yet a subtle shift emerged. Meghan moved from a space of raw shock toward strategic contemplation, thinking carefully about the public statements, media engagements, and personal actions that could shape perception, protect Harry, and secure a legacy independent of royal endorsement. The day's events had left an indelible mark, both personally and publicly, but they had also illuminated the boundaries between institutional power and personal agency. Meghan understood, with clarity and determination, that navigating this new reality required not only emotional resilience, but also tactical intelligence, communication acumen, and an unwavering sense of purpose. The moment was both a crisis and an opportunity, a duality that demanded courage, reflection, and decisive action. By the time morning light filtered through the windows, Meghan had begun to map her next steps, balancing private grief with public necessity. She recognized that the narrative was no longer solely about personal relationships or marital dynamics. It had become a complex interplay of media, public perception, historical precedent, and the future trajectory of the monarchy itself. The revocation of titles was both a symbolic and practical rupture, a catalyst for reevaluation, reflection, and strategic repositioning. Meghan understood that her response in the coming days would be scrutinized, analyzed, and interpreted by audiences across the globe. The stakes were immense, but within the intensity of this crucible, a clarity began to emerge, a recognition that survival, influence, and dignity were not contingent on titles alone, but on intellect, resilience, and the ability to navigate complexity with precision and authenticity. The announcement came at precisely 9 a.m., delivered with the precision and authority that only a royal statement could command. The palace spokesperson's voice was measured, almost clinical, but the message was clear. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were officially stripped of all their royal titles. No qualifiers, no temporary suspensions, no vague language. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex were no longer representatives of the crown, no longer entitled to the privileges, security, or formal recognition that had been theirs by marriage. In the language of protocol, this was an irrevocable act. In the language of the heart, it was devastating. Inside the palace walls, the atmosphere was tense. Courtiers whispered in hushed tones, aides scurried to relay instructions, and the ever-present media lens hovered like a predatory bird ready to capture every reaction. Meghan, receiving the news from Harry, felt a sharp pang of disbelief that quickly gave way to an overwhelming sense of isolation. Titles had been more than ceremonial. They were a tangible connection to the institution she had married into, a public acknowledgement of her role and influence. Stripped of these, she felt as though the very identity she had constructed over years was being unraveled in a single, formal stroke. Harry's reaction was a mixture of shock and simmering anger. He had long anticipated friction within the family and the media's relentless scrutiny, but the finality of this declaration hit differently. He paced the room, voice low but tense, articulating his outrage at the manner in which the decision had been communicated. To him, this was not merely a political maneuver or an administrative update. It was a personal indictment, a public censure that questioned their loyalty, judgment, and worthiness. Meghan watched him closely, understanding that his fierce protectiveness now clashed with his inability to shield them from the institutional machinery at work. Together, they were partners in adversity, yet even their bond was being tested by the sheer weight of the announcement. Outside the palace, the world reacted instantaneously. Social media erupted with speculation, outrage, and polarized opinion. Journalists dissected every phrase of the official statement. Analysts predicted potential fallout for the monarchy, and opinion pieces appeared at a rate that rivaled the speed of the breaking news itself. Headlines framed the event in dramatic terms. Royal fallout. Sussex titles revoked forever. Monarchy draws the line. Harry and Meghan face permanent severance from crown. Each headline amplified the emotional stakes, broadcasting the couple's personal crisis to millions of people who had followed their story for years. Within hours, Meghan's personal and professional networks were inundated with messages, some sympathetic, some incredulous, and others openly critical. Friends and advisors attempted to offer guidance, but the enormity of the situation left even the most experienced courtiers uncertain about how to proceed. Every conversation was tinged with urgency and tension, as if even the act of speaking carried the potential to worsen an already combustible situation. Meghan realized that navigating this storm would require not only emotional resilience, but strategic precision, a duality that demanded constant attention and careful calculation. The symbolism of the titles themselves was not lost on Meghan. A duke and duchess in the British monarchy are not simply ceremonial designations. They confer access, influence, and a form of protection. Security, protocol, public trust, and ceremonial roles all flow from these titles. Their removal was not just a personal loss, but a practical handicap, impacting their ability to engage in public work, philanthropic initiatives, and international engagements. Meghan understood that this revocation would reverberate far beyond her personal life, shaping public perception and historical narrative for years to come. Inside the royal circle, reactions varied. Some expressed regret over the necessity of such a decisive action, while others argued that it was inevitable, given the couple's increasingly independent path and the public controversies that had surrounded them. Strategists within the palace weighed the message this decision would send to the public, to other members of the family, and to the institution itself. Every detail was analyzed: the timing of the announcement, the phrasing of the decree, the potential for legal ramifications. In essence, the stripping of titles was as much a calculated statement about institutional authority as it was a personal consequence. Meghan's thoughts wandered back to her early days in the royal family. She recalled the careful etiquette lessons, the intricate choreography of appearances, and the relentless pressure to balance visibility with humility. She had learned, sometimes painfully, that every gesture was scrutinized, every word interpreted. Now, All of that training and preparation seemed overshadowed by a single, irreversible decision. The public and media focus had shifted from her charitable work, advocacy, and personal achievements to the narrative of loss, scandal, and exclusion. Amid the chaos, Meghan experienced a profound internal reckoning. Titles, once seen as symbols of belonging and influence, now served as markers of absence, a tangible representation of exclusion from an institution she had tried to honor and navigate with care. The emotional weight was compounded by the visibility of their plight. Millions were watching, analyzing, and forming judgments, often without context or compassion. This was not just about personal identity. It was about the intersection of private emotion, public expectation, and historical consequence. Harry and Meghan's subsequent decisions became critical. Every action, from public statements to private communications, required meticulous planning. Legal counsel was consulted to understand potential implications. Advisors strategized for media interactions, and every possible response was weighed against both immediate emotional needs and long-term consequences. They were navigating a landscape where personal feelings and institutional authority collided, and where missteps could exacerbate public scrutiny or historical judgment. Even in the midst of despair, Meghan began to recognize glimmers of agency. While titles had been revoked, her capacity to act, influence, and engage remained intact. The challenge was to redefine the terms of her identity, influence, and public presence outside the formal structures that had previously defined her role. In a sense, the stripping of titles, while painful, opened a space for reinvention, a chance to exert agency on her own terms, to craft a narrative that could resonate with supporters, critics, and the broader public alike. The first hours after the announcement set the tone for what would become a prolonged period of reflection, strategy, and emotional recalibration. Meghan's initial shock gradually transitioned into a complex mix of grief, anger, and determination. She understood that while the palace's decision was irreversible in legal and ceremonial terms, the battle for public perception, personal dignity, and future influence was only beginning. Every moment, every interaction, and every statement would contribute to a new chapter in their lives, one defined not by inherited titles, but by resilience, strategy, and the deliberate shaping of a legacy under intense scrutiny. This chapter establishes the initial impact of the royal declaration, providing context for the emotional, practical, and strategic consequences Meghan and Harry faced. It sets the stage for the unfolding drama, the personal reckonings, and the calculated responses that will define the subsequent chapters of the story. The announcement of Meghan and Harry's titles being stripped did not remain confined to the palace walls. It detonated across the globe almost instantaneously. Within minutes, news outlets in London, New York, Sydney, and Tokyo had updated their websites, rolling out alerts and breaking news banners that screamed of royal upheaval. Social media platforms became battlegrounds of opinion, speculation, and outrage. Hashtags like #Sussex titles revoked and #Royal Shock trended worldwide. The immediacy of digital news created a relentless cycle, with every post, every tweet, and every live broadcast amplifying the drama of the moment. For Meghan and Harry, the magnitude of public attention was both overwhelming and relentless, magnifying the emotional intensity of their personal crisis. In homes across the United Kingdom, viewers watched televised coverage that dissected the announcement with clinical precision. News anchors analyzed phrasing, political commentators speculated about ramifications for the monarchy, and royal experts debated precedent and protocol. Some framed the decision as necessary to preserve the integrity of the institution, while others criticized it as unnecessarily punitive, suggesting that it reflected personal animosities rather than institutional necessity. The polarized coverage created a storm of opinions, with viewers divided between defenders of the monarchy and sympathizers of the couple. Public sentiment was split, fueling intense debates on breakfast shows, podcasts, and live streams, where every viewer seemed to have a verdict on what Meghan and Harry had done or failed to do to provoke such a historic act. In social media spaces, reactions were equally dramatic. Memes, GIFs, and commentary spread like wildfire. Users dissected images from past royal events, overlaying text that mocked or sympathized with the couple. Some accounts circulated conspiracy theories, claiming the revocation was part of a larger scheme orchestrated by senior family members to consolidate power. Others speculated about legal repercussions, financial implications, or the impact on the couple's future philanthropic endeavors. The volume of speculation was staggering, and it only intensified as journalists, influencers, and commentators weighed in with hot takes. For Meghan, who had long struggled with media scrutiny, the public frenzy was an unrelenting reminder that her personal and professional life was now inextricably entwined with global attention. Media crews camped outside the Sussex residence and other royal estates, broadcasting live as courtiers and staff moved discreetly through the grounds. Each arrival or departure was analyzed, each facial expression dissected for hidden meaning. News networks sought interviews with anyone connected to the royal circle, from former staff members to distant relatives, creating a dizzying web of commentary that blurred the line between fact and conjecture. Analysts debated whether the couple might contest the decision legally, speculate about the timing of future public statements, and anticipate their next moves. Every broadcast, every analysis segment, and every news article contributed to a growing narrative that this was not merely a personal setback, but a historical rupture in the monarchy itself. Among the general public, reactions varied widely. Some expressed outrage on behalf of Meghan and Harry, framing the decision as unfair and excessively harsh. They pointed to years of public service, charitable work, and advocacy efforts that they believed should have shielded the couple from such a sweeping penalty. Others applauded the monarchy's decisiveness, framing it as an assertion of authority and tradition, a necessary act to maintain order and respect for established protocols. Street interviews captured candid responses from citizens who were visibly shocked, emotional, or in disbelief. The spectrum of reactions, from anger to sorrow to casual curiosity, highlighted just how intertwined the couple's fate had become with national sentiment and public imagination. The international press, not bound by the same proximity or protocol, added another layer of intensity. Papers in Europe, Asia, and North America printed front-page spreads detailing the event with dramatic imagery. Stern portraits of King Charles and Prince William juxtaposed against candid shots of Meghan and Harry at public appearances. Editorials speculated about the ripple effects on other royal families, potential diplomatic implications, and even the future of media coverage regarding royal matters. The global attention amplified the pressure on the couple, reinforcing the reality that this was not a private matter but a public spectacle, one in which millions felt invested, judged, and entitled to commentary. Analysts also explored the psychological impact of the announcement. Experts in public relations, human behavior, and emotional resilience weighed in on how the couple might navigate the tidal wave of scrutiny. They discussed strategies for controlling narrative, mitigating damage, and preserving mental health amidst relentless attention. Psychologists highlighted the potential for stress, anxiety, and feelings of isolation, noting that public figures, even those accustomed to scrutiny, often experience acute emotional reactions when faced with irrevocable actions that challenge identity, authority, and belonging. Meghan and Harry were now confronting not only the loss of titles, but also the global interpretation of that loss, magnified through constant observation and commentary. For Meghan, the media frenzy carried an additional, more personal sting. Every report, every segment, every viral post seemed to scrutinize her motives, actions, and public persona. Headlines questioned her behavior, dissected her statements, and speculated on her future moves. In some ways, this relentless gaze echoed the very pressures she had faced upon entering the royal family, but with an added intensity now amplified by the official stripping of titles. The combination of public exposure and institutional exclusion created a uniquely isolating experience, compelling her to consider carefully how to respond while maintaining composure, dignity, and strategic foresight. Amidst the global coverage, some voices called for context and empathy. Royal commentators emphasized the human dimension behind the headlines, reminding viewers that titles, while symbolic, represented real emotional and social capital. Observers urged a balanced perspective, acknowledging that while the revocation of titles was unprecedented in modern times, it was also a deeply personal blow for the individuals involved. These voices, though fewer in number, highlighted the nuanced reality that beneath the spectacle and media frenzy, Meghan and Harry were experiencing profound disruption in both identity and emotional equilibrium. As the day progressed, the story evolved rapidly. Live updates, press conferences, and expert analyses created a continuous news cycle, leaving little time for reflection or respite. Every new development, whether a public statement, a legal consideration, or a social media post, was dissected, interpreted, and debated. For Meghan and Harry, this meant that the initial shock of the announcement was compounded by the relentless need to respond thoughtfully, strategically, and publicly. Each decision carried weight not only for immediate perception, but for historical legacy and future reputation. Chapter 2 concludes by capturing the breadth of the public and media response to the royal announcement. It portrays the intense scrutiny, emotional reactions, and global attention that amplified the personal and institutional impact of losing titles. This sets the stage for deeper exploration of Meghan and Harry's emotional journey, strategic decisions, and interactions with the royal family in subsequent chapters. The moment the news settled in, away from cameras, hashtags, and global scrutiny, Meghan Markle found herself in a space that was as isolated as it was surreal. The official statement from Prince William and the palace had been concise, formal, yet devastating. Her and Harry's royal titles were stripped forever. There would be no appeals, no second chances, no ceremonial grace to cushion the blow. In the solitude of her residence, the reality of losing a part of her identity, a title that had connected her to centuries of royal heritage, hit with crushing intensity. The grandeur of Buckingham Palace, the pomp of public appearances, and the ceremonial recognition she had once been privy to now existed in a void, inaccessible and irrevocably severed. The emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. Meghan's mind raced with memories of her introduction into the royal family, the excitement and anxiety of her wedding day, and the countless moments in which she had endeavored to balance her public role with her personal ambitions. The palace corridors she had once navigated with pride, the royal protocols she had meticulously learned, and the expectations of family and public alike now loomed as distant, unattainable constructs. Each thought carried the weight of loss, a stark reminder that the privileges she had once taken for granted were no longer hers. The isolation amplified her emotions, leaving her to confront not just the public fallout, but the personal sense of disconnection from an identity she had carefully curated over years. The psychological strain intensified as Meghan reflected on her relationship with Harry. Their shared experiences, moments of joy, struggle, and defiance against the relentless media, had been intertwined with their royal titles. Now, with that defining element removed, Meghan grappled with the duality of personal and institutional loss. The titles were more than symbolic. They represented access, authority, and social recognition. Without them, the couple was effectively recast as private citizens, navigating a world where the deference, prestige, and structured support of the monarchy were no longer guaranteed. This shift was profound, forcing Meghan to reevaluate her sense of self, her public persona, and the practical realities of living outside the protective cocoon of royal privilege. In the private confines of her residence, Meghan experienced a spectrum of emotions that oscillated between disbelief, despair, and frustration. Her heart raced, palms sweated, and thoughts spiraled as she replayed the moment of the announcement in her mind. The formal language of the statement, detached, unyielding, and public, belied the personal pain it inflicted. She questioned her own actions, decisions, and the trajectory of her life leading up to this point. Was there something she could have done differently? Could she have prevented the permanent stripping of titles? These questions, though unanswerable, created a relentless loop of mental anguish, intensifying the private nature of her breakdown. The gravity of the situation extended beyond personal identity. Practical concerns surged to the forefront. Meghan began to contemplate the implications of the decision on financial security, social obligations, and public perception. Without the official status of Duke and Duchess of Sussex, access to certain privileges, residences, and ceremonial roles would be restricted. The decision also raised questions about ongoing media engagements, endorsements, and philanthropic initiatives. In these moments, the abstract pain of identity loss became concrete, pressing her to confront the real-world consequences of a decision she had no control over. The combination of emotional upheaval and practical uncertainty created a multidimensional crisis, one that challenged every aspect of her life. As the hours passed, Meghan's emotional state deepened. She vacillated between tears and bouts of silence, her mind attempting to process an outcome that defied her expectations. Memories of earlier struggles. The media scrutiny, the public criticism, and the intense familial negotiations surfaced with renewed intensity. Each recollection carried emotional resonance, reinforcing feelings of vulnerability, isolation, and the enormity of the current moment. The breakdown was not a singular, explosive event, but rather a series of waves, each cresting with renewed intensity, leaving her emotionally spent yet cognitively aware of the stakes involved. In tandem with Meghan's internal turmoil, her interactions with close aides and confidants became pivotal. Trusted advisors attempted to offer support, guidance, and reassurance, but even their presence could not fully mitigate the emotional shock. Conversations were careful, measured, and strategic, aimed at preserving composure while navigating the practical aftermath. Meghan's responses varied, ranging from candid expressions of grief to contemplative silence. Each dialogue reinforced the reality that the loss of titles was not a momentary setback, but a permanent restructuring of her role, her identity, and her position within the royal narrative. The breakdown also carried an undercurrent of anger and frustration. Meghan confronted feelings of injustice, perceiving the revocation of titles as a punitive measure rather than a procedural necessity. The abruptness of the announcement, the formal detachment of the language, and the public exposure of the decision compounded her emotional response. Anger mingled with sorrow, creating a complex emotional landscape in which Meghan grappled with both personal betrayal and the inexorable machinery of institutional authority. Beyond the immediate emotional consequences, Meghan's private breakdown had subtle ripple effects on her strategic thinking. As the initial shock ebbed, she began to consider next steps. How to protect her public image, how to manage media narratives, and how to safeguard personal and familial well-being. The breakdown, while deeply personal, became a crucible in which strategic recalibrations began to take shape. Each tear, each moment of despair, carried the weight of contemplation, reflection, and eventual resolution, laying the groundwork for how she would respond to the cascading effects of the announcement in both private and public spheres. Meghan's private breakdown, however, was not confined to emotional or cognitive spheres alone. The physical toll was significant. Sleepless nights, disrupted routines, and heightened stress manifested in fatigue, tension, and acute awareness of bodily sensations. Her health became a mirror of the emotional upheaval, reinforcing the profound impact of losing not just a title, but the associated identity, privilege, and societal validation. This convergence of emotional, cognitive, and physical strain created a holistic crisis, underscoring the severity of the moment and the challenge of navigating life in its aftermath. As the first day of the announcement drew to a close, Meghan's breakdown gradually transitioned from acute emotional collapse to reflective contemplation. In solitude, she considered the ramifications for her personal growth, her public image, and her relationship with Harry. The intensity of the moment began to crystallize into clarity, allowing her to process both the pain and the potential strategies for navigating the new reality. The breakdown, though deeply distressing, became a turning point, a juncture at which emotional response began to intersect with deliberate, purposeful consideration of the path forward. Chapter 3 concludes by capturing the deeply personal and multifaceted nature of Meghan's private breakdown. It portrays the intensity of her emotional, cognitive, and physical response to the loss of titles, while laying the groundwork for subsequent chapters exploring Harry's reaction, family dynamics, and strategic decisions in the wake of the announcement. Prince Harry, upon receiving the official communication confirming that he and Meghan had been stripped of their royal titles, experienced a profound mix of shock, disbelief, and simmering anger. Unlike Meghan, whose immediate response had been internalized and private, Harry's reaction was a potent mix of outward frustration and protective concern. The moment he read the statement, he was acutely aware that the decision not only severed a symbolic connection to the monarchy, but also marked a public declaration of disfavor, one that would dominate headlines, social media, and global conversation. For Harry, this was not merely a procedural matter. It was a personal affront, one that resonated deeply with his sense of identity, loyalty, and familial bonds. The initial disbelief was almost palpable. How could the institution he had been born into, an institution he had dedicated his life to in countless capacities, make such a unilateral decision without prior discussion or nuanced negotiation? The letters from the palace were formal, terse, and devoid of the warmth or diplomacy that might have softened the blow. The words "revoked forever" hit with a cold precision, a phrase that left no room for appeal, nuance, or compromise. Harry's mind raced, replaying every interaction, every meeting, every subtle negotiation that had led up to this moment, searching for signs he may have missed or misinterpreted. Each thought intensified the sense of betrayal, transforming disbelief into a powerful emotional storm. Anger began to build quickly, an almost visceral reaction that surged through him like electricity. Harry felt a combination of indignation and outrage, directed not just at the formal decision, but also at the manner in which it had been communicated. The public announcement, simultaneously broadcast across media channels worldwide, felt like an intentional display, designed to exert control, assert dominance, and enforce compliance. Harry's protective instincts for Meghan were immediate. He was acutely aware that while he had long navigated public scrutiny with measured resilience, Meghan now faced an even harsher spotlight. He experienced an intense desire to shield her from both public judgment and private humiliation, yet he also recognized the limitations of his power in the face of institutional authority. Harry's reaction was further complicated by the implications for their children. Archie and Lilibet's roles, titles, and perceived positions within the royal hierarchy were now in question, and Harry knew the public and media would speculate endlessly about the family's status, the security provisions in place, and the social implications for the children. This concern added a layer of urgency to his emotional response. Protecting his family, both emotionally and practically, became intertwined with processing his own personal feelings of anger and loss. He contemplated the challenges of managing the fallout, balancing the desire to respond publicly with the need to maintain privacy and dignity for Meghan and their children. As Harry navigated these emotions, he also engaged in a rapid cognitive assessment of potential strategies. He recognized that this moment, though emotionally charged, required careful deliberation. Public statements, media engagements, and strategic alliances needed to be considered not just in the context of immediate emotion, but in terms of long-term implications for reputation, familial relationships, and public perception. Harry's experience with media scrutiny, legal challenges, and public diplomacy informed his thinking. He knew that an impulsive reaction could exacerbate the situation, drawing more attention, more judgment, and potentially undermining both his and Meghan's ability to navigate the new reality with dignity. Despite the strategic assessment, Harry's emotional response remained raw and potent. He experienced waves of frustration that at times bordered on despair, coupled with moments of reflective contemplation. The juxtaposition of emotion and calculation created a dynamic internal state, one that oscillated between reactionary intensity and deliberate consideration. In these moments, Harry's protective instincts for Meghan, his awareness of the media landscape, and his understanding of royal protocol collided, producing an intricate tapestry of emotional, cognitive, and strategic responses. Conversations with close advisors and confidants became an immediate priority. Harry reached out to trusted aides to discuss both the emotional and practical dimensions of the situation. Each conversation required balancing vulnerability with composure, emotional authenticity with strategic awareness. Advisors offered insights, potential responses, and guidance on media strategy, legal considerations, and public messaging. While these discussions provided a framework for navigating the immediate aftermath, they also highlighted the complexity of the moment and the delicate nature of decisions to come. Harry's response was not limited to personal reflection or advisory consultations. It extended into action-oriented planning. He considered how to communicate with Meghan, how to prepare the family for public scrutiny, and how to protect their privacy and security in the days ahead. These considerations were intricate, requiring coordination across multiple domains, from legal counsel and media strategy to personal support networks. The emotional intensity of the moment, combined with the practical necessity of planning, underscored the multidimensional nature of Harry's reaction. Even as he processed the immediate implications, Harry could not ignore the broader symbolic resonance of the announcement. The revocation of titles represented more than personal loss. It signaled a public assertion of authority, a recalibration of power dynamics within the royal family, and a reshaping of public narrative. Harry was acutely aware of how this would be perceived globally, how the media would frame the story, and how public opinion might evolve. The stakes extended far beyond personal feelings, encompassing historical legacies, familial relationships, and global perception of the monarchy's authority and fairness. Throughout this period, Harry oscillated between private emotional intensity and public composure. He recognized the necessity of maintaining a steady presence for Meghan, for their children, and for the team of advisors and allies relying on his guidance. Yet behind closed doors, his emotions, shock, disbelief, anger, and protectiveness, remained unfiltered and raw. The juxtaposition of internal turmoil and external composure highlighted the complexity of his immediate reaction and the depth of emotional resilience required to navigate such a profound personal and institutional upheaval. Harry's immediate reaction set the stage for subsequent developments, influencing decisions, public statements, and family dynamics in the days and weeks following the announcement. The combination of emotional intensity, protective instinct, strategic thinking, and awareness of public perception created a multidimensional response that would shape not only his own narrative, but the broader narrative of Meghan, their children, and the royal family. The announcement from Prince William reverberated like a shockwave across the globe, and for Meghan Markle, the impact was immediate, visible, and profoundly personal. Unlike Harry, whose reaction had been a mix of private reflection and controlled response, Meghan's response manifested in a very public, emotional collapse, leaving onlookers, aides, and media alike stunned. The moment her phone lit up with the official communication, she felt an overwhelming sense of disbelief, humiliation, and fear. This was not just about titles. It was about identity, influence, and the very public image she had meticulously cultivated over the years. The phrase, "out forever," reverberated in her mind like a bell tolling a funeral for a life she had imagined but would never fully inhabit. Meghan's first instinct was to retreat, to find a private space where she could process the enormity of the moment. Yet, the nature of her life made complete privacy impossible. Cameras, palace aides, and media speculation created a pressure cooker of scrutiny and expectation. As she moved through the hallways of her residence, every glance, every whisper seemed amplified, a reflection of the judgment she feared. The world was watching, and she was acutely aware that any emotional response could be dissected, analyzed, and weaponized by both media outlets and public opinion. Her physical reaction was unmistakable. Meghan's hands trembled, her breathing became shallow, and tears welled uncontrollably as the full gravity of the situation took hold. Close aides rushed to her side, attempting to offer support and comfort, but even the presence of trusted confidants could not fully mitigate the sense of isolation she experienced. The public nature of her life compounded the emotional intensity. She knew that even within the confines of her private residence, the ripple effects of the announcement were already spreading, with news outlets preparing breaking headlines and social media conversations erupting in real time. The psychological impact of losing her royal titles was multifaceted. On one level, it represented a symbolic severing from the monarchy, a public declaration of disfavor from the institution she had married into. On another, it challenged the very persona she had cultivated, one intertwined with influence, privilege, and public recognition. Meghan had invested years into building a narrative of service, advocacy, and global relevance, often leveraging her royal platform to amplify social causes, charitable initiatives, and personal projects. With this announcement, the legitimacy of that narrative was suddenly questioned, leaving her to grapple with the personal and professional ramifications simultaneously. Compounding the emotional intensity was the awareness of how this would be portrayed by the media. Meghan, experienced in public scrutiny, understood that the press thrives on moments of vulnerability, and her visible distress would almost certainly dominate headlines. She anticipated the range of narratives, from sensationalist portrayals of scandal and overreaction to sympathetic interpretations highlighting the emotional toll of royal life. This anticipation added a layer of anxiety to her emotional collapse, creating a feedback loop where fear of public judgment intensified the emotional response itself. In the immediate hours following the announcement, Meghan's interactions with her staff and advisors were fraught with tension and urgency. She demanded clarity, answers, and guidance, seeking to understand the full implications of the decision. Questions arose regarding legal standing, potential avenues for appeal, and the impact on her personal projects and charitable engagements. Each question, however, was shadowed by the emotional weight of the moment, making decision-making more complex and emotionally taxing. Observers who witnessed Meghan during this period noted a profound mixture of strength and vulnerability. While tears and visible distress marked her initial response, there were moments where determination and resilience surfaced, hinting at her awareness that she would need to navigate both public scrutiny and private emotional recovery. The oscillation between emotional vulnerability and steely determination created a dynamic portrait of a woman grappling with unprecedented personal and public upheaval. The public collapse also had immediate social ramifications. Within royal circles, aides and insiders speculated about the potential fallout, the conversations behind closed doors, and the long-term implications for familial relationships. Meghan's collapse was not merely an emotional episode. It became a lens through which colleagues, family members, and observers analyzed loyalty, influence, and the shifting dynamics of power within the royal family. Her vulnerability, while human and relatable, became intertwined with political, social, and familial considerations, amplifying the complexity of the situation. Meghan's mental and emotional state during this period reflected an intense internal dialogue. She grappled with feelings of betrayal, disappointment, and fear, questioning both the actions of family members and the permanence of her circumstances. The phrase, "out forever," lingered, a haunting echo that underscored the finality and public nature of the decision. This internal struggle was compounded by memories of previous confrontations, perceived slights, and efforts to maintain agency within a highly structured and often rigid institutional environment. Despite the emotional turbulence, Meghan began to consider strategies for reclaiming a sense of control. She understood that visibility, narrative management, and strategic communication would be essential in mitigating the impact of the announcement on her personal and professional identity. Conversations with advisors, legal counsel, and trusted confidants centered on immediate steps, including public statements, media engagement strategies, and the protection of personal projects and charitable work. Each decision required balancing authenticity, emotional transparency, and calculated foresight, highlighting the multidimensional nature of her response. Meghan's collapse was also a catalyst for reflection, forcing her to confront the realities of royal life, public perception, and personal ambition. She contemplated how her decisions, actions, and public persona had influenced the current situation and considered the path forward in a world where both personal and public identities were deeply intertwined. The emotional intensity of the moment created space for introspection, ultimately shaping her approach to future challenges, public interactions, and familial negotiations. The day of the announcement blurred into a series of emotional and logistical maneuvers, with Meghan balancing the immediacy of her emotional response against the necessity of strategic planning. Every phone call, every meeting, and every interaction became a reflection of the delicate balance between vulnerability and resilience, public perception and private reality, immediate reaction and long-term strategy. The collapse, while intensely personal, was inseparable from the broader narrative of power, influence, and public scrutiny that defined Meghan's life. In the immediate aftermath, the global response was already unfolding. Social media erupted with speculation, media outlets prepared exhaustive coverage, and royal correspondents scrambled to contextualize the unprecedented decision. Meghan's emotional collapse became both a personal and public event, a convergence of private vulnerability and global attention. The intensity of this response highlighted the profound intersection of personal emotion and public spectacle, a hallmark of Meghan's unique position within the modern royal landscape. By the end of the day, Meghan's collapse had transitioned from raw emotional reaction to strategic contemplation. The initial waves of shock, disbelief, and fear gave way to measured reflection, the beginnings of planning, and an awareness of the broader implications for her family, career, and public image. The emotional arc of the day illustrated the complex interplay between human vulnerability and strategic foresight, revealing a portrait of a woman navigating the uncharted waters of public disgrace, familial conflict, and personal identity simultaneously. As Meghan Markle struggled to process the immediate shock of her public collapse, the royal family was already mobilizing a calculated response. For decades, the monarchy had relied on a blend of tradition, discretion, and strategic communication to maintain its image, and this moment would be no exception. Behind the elegant facades of palaces and meticulously choreographed public appearances, advisors, legal counsel, and senior family members convened to map out the path forward, fully aware that the global spotlight would magnify every decision, every word, and every gesture. Prince William, in particular, played a central role in orchestrating the response. Known for his composed demeanor and acute understanding of public perception, William recognized the delicate balance between enforcing authority and maintaining familial decorum. The decision to strip Meghan and Harry of their titles, while severe, had been presented as the culmination of extensive deliberation and legal review, ensuring that the action appeared decisive, justified, and unavoidable. William's communications team was tasked with framing the announcement in a manner that underscored the monarchy's commitment to protocol, tradition, and the public good, while also managing the optics of potential backlash. Inside Buckingham Palace, discussions were tense and meticulous. Advisors analyzed historical precedents, reviewed legal frameworks, and assessed the potential fallout across multiple domains: domestic media coverage, international press, public opinion, and the reputational risks to other members of the royal family. Every detail mattered, from the phrasing of official statements to the timing of their release. The strategy emphasized control over narrative, preemptive management of criticism, and the reinforcement of the monarchy's enduring stability and authority. The role of Queen Elizabeth in this strategic response was pivotal, even if largely conducted behind the scenes. While the Queen's public statements were characteristically measured, her influence over internal deliberations was decisive. Advisors reported that she had emphasized the importance of clarity and consistency, cautioning against any approach that could be misinterpreted as weakness or indecision. Her guidance reflected a deep understanding of institutional imperatives. The monarchy's survival depends not only on ceremonial duties and public admiration, but also on the perception of order, discipline, and moral authority. Prince Charles, now a key figure in shaping the family's narrative, balanced the demands of tradition with the evolving realities of media scrutiny. He recognized that Meghan and Harry's story had already captured global attention, and any misstep could exacerbate the controversy, potentially eroding public trust in the institution. Charles's advisors prepared briefing documents, talking points, and contingency plans, outlining strategies to address inquiries from journalists, diplomatic channels, and international observers. Their goal was to ensure that every public-facing action reinforced the perception of measured control and principled leadership. Within this strategic framework, legal considerations were paramount. The revocation of Meghan and Harry's titles was not merely a symbolic act. It carried tangible legal, financial, and social ramifications. Legal teams reviewed agreements, historical charters, and precedents, evaluating potential challenges and formulating defenses against anticipated claims of unfair treatment. Every document, memo, and internal communication was meticulously cross-checked to ensure alignment with constitutional principles, royal protocol, and public messaging objectives. The aim was clear: to preempt disputes, protect institutional integrity, and reinforce the perception of impartiality. The monarchy also understood the importance of narrative management beyond the palace walls. Media training, carefully curated press releases, and controlled interviews were employed to shape public perception. Senior officials were instructed on messaging consistency, tone, and emphasis, ensuring that the monarchy's position would be communicated clearly and authoritatively. Analysts predicted likely media angles, public reactions, and social media discourse, enabling proactive engagement with journalists and opinion leaders. The goal was to transform what could have been perceived as a scandal into a controlled, comprehensible narrative that reinforced the monarchy's authority and moral legitimacy. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Meghan's collapse began influencing internal dynamics within the family. Tensions between senior members and younger royals intensified as advisors navigated the fine line between enforcement of protocol and familial empathy. Discussions included potential repercussions for Harry, the long-term implications for relationships with extended relatives, and the management of joint public appearances in a manner that minimized conflict while maximizing public confidence. The palace's internal cohesion was tested, requiring careful mediation, discretion, and the strategic deployment of loyal staff members. The family's strategic response also encompassed crisis preparedness in the digital realm. Social media platforms had become powerful arenas for public debate, speculation, and misinformation. Advisors monitored trends, flagged emerging narratives, and coordinated responses across multiple channels, seeking to counteract falsehoods while reinforcing official messaging. The speed of information dissemination necessitated rapid decision-making, real-time analysis, and agile communication strategies, highlighting the intersection of modern technology with centuries-old royal traditions. In parallel, charitable organizations and public initiatives associated with Meghan and Harry required careful handling. Advisors reviewed funding structures, leadership roles, and ongoing projects to prevent disruption, maintain public confidence, and protect institutional credibility. The goal was to ensure continuity of service while reinforcing the distinction between private endeavors and the official responsibilities of titled royals. Every step was designed to protect the monarchy's reputation and emphasize the boundaries of influence, authority, and accountability. Psychologically, the royal family's strategic response reflected a blend of duty, pragmatism, and emotional intelligence. Leaders recognized that decisions of this magnitude carry profound emotional consequences, both for those directly affected and for the broader public perception. By combining legal, public relations, and interpersonal strategies, they sought to navigate a complex landscape of human emotion, media scrutiny, and institutional responsibility. This multifaceted approach underscored the monarchy's capacity for resilience, adaptation, and deliberate action under pressure. The orchestration of this response was not without challenges. Advisors had to anticipate potential missteps, manage conflicting perspectives within the family, and mitigate the risk of unauthorized leaks or misinterpretation. Scenario planning, media simulations, and contingency briefings were employed to prepare for a wide range of outcomes. Every communication, from official statements to private directives, was calibrated to achieve maximum impact while minimizing risk. The combination of foresight, coordination, and disciplined execution demonstrated the monarchy's enduring ability to maintain authority even in moments of intense personal and public crisis.